the celebration of the liturgy in Greek. Now, before 312 and the Edict of Milan, already before that, there had been development and there had been quite a lot of growth in the church. And so you already were starting to see the construction of buildings specifically intended for use as churches, all right? Now, after 312, that process exploded, but it began even before that. And along with that construction or adoption of purpose-built church buildings, along the same lines, there was also a process of what I would call formalization of the liturgy going on. If you recall from the readings we looked at from the Didache, from Hippolytus, from Justin Martyr, when they describe the prayers, the words of the liturgy, usually they'll say, well, the presider or the priest or the bishop will say something along these lines. All right? There were not prescribed liturgical books at this point. There were not prescribed prayer formulas. That's something that developed later as part of this process of formalization. And that process took place for a couple of reasons. One, with the growth of the church, all right, there was felt to be a need for, we need to make sure that we're all kind of doing the same thing here. So that led to the desire for formalization or standardization. Another thing is, and you know, let's face it, all right, most of us are not gifted when it comes to spontaneous prayer. If we're making it up as we go along, it tends to sound like this. Oh God, we just want to pray because you love us and you're so great, and oh God, would you help us, and oh God, be with us, and I mean, you know, I'm not going to doubt anyone's sincerity, but it's not really going to be the kind of thing that moves anyone else to pray with you, all right? It does not capture your intellect and imagination. You know, most of the time when we are praying spontaneously, it's just not very articulate. And the church always wants the faithful to have an articulated understanding of the faith. The church wants in her worship, in her liturgy, to really articulate, to really express the fullness of what we believe. And that too led to this desire of formalization. So up through the 2nd, 3rd century, 3rd century really, most of the liturgical prayer was, if not exactly spontaneous, it followed perhaps the same formulas. Priests and bishops would be, you know, they would have these sources to guide them so that, again, they'd say something like that, but there weren't prescribed prayer texts. That is something that developed really in the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, by the time we get to the 4th century, the church is moving from being a persecuted minority to becoming the church that is tolerated and even is beginning to become what you might call established or even privileged, okay? And because of this, the church grew. It grew a lot, all all right? And the church grew very rapidly in the first centuries of its founding, but once it was officially okay to be a Christian, the church exploded in membership. And that meant that again, getting back to spontaneity. If it's just, say, a dozen of us gathered around a table together, all right, spontaneity is pretty easy. But if it's 300 or 400 of us, well, you can't be spontaneous anymore. And so again, there's this need for formalization. Furthermore, there's a theological development going on. Understanding that the liturgy is this, as we've discussed before, this making present of Christ and his work here and now. And so, if that's what we realize is going on, then the desire is, well, we want to make sure we get it right. We don't want to, we don't want to be praying the wrong way. And this is a principle that I've discussed before. It comes from Prosper of Aquitaine. Prosper of Aquitaine, the principle lex orandi, lex credendi. And I know I've mentioned this before, but I'll write it down again. Lex orandi, lex credendi, or the rule of prayer is the rule of faith. What we believe is embodied in our liturgical celebration. And so, that being the case, there's a greater understanding, appreciation of the need to make sure that our lex orandi, what we're doing in the liturgy, really accurately reflects the faith we profess. Now, with the growth and the toleration of the church, well, now the church is able to really go all out in terms of public worship, public expressions of faith. And so you see the construction of huge new churches. Most, for example, in Rome, most of the great ancient churches of Rome, St. Mary Major, St. Peter's Basilica, St. John Lateran, most of those churches have their origins in the 4th through 6th centuries. They were built during this time when the church was exploding in membership and had become officially approved. Did your hand up there?
Were the earlier churches than that in the city walls, or did they have to be outside still?
Well, again, remember, we're talking about, for the most part, homes that were either, they would use them for worship, or the home would, they would take a private home and turn it into their...
Well, like churches that are, have notoriety, those were finally in Rome itself?
Oh, yes, yeah, but I guess to answer your question, these house churches would have been found anywhere.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But the great basilicas, great churches themselves, of course, were built within the city, in the heart of the city. Again, that's another image or another, another indicator of this approval or institutionalization of the church, and that is, you see these great churches being built not just within the city walls, but right in the heart of the city, all right? Literally next door to the Roman Forum, which was the very heart of the city itself. And there's nothing that says this is approved, this is okay, than having your public place of worship basically right next to City Hall, okay? So, like I said, there is this great development in public worship. And so you start to see things like processions, public processions in the city. Processions were a huge big deal in this period of the church, all right? And different churches would basically kind of try to outdo each other in the size and the magnificence of their processions, all right? And in some places, when you had these great theological controversies, like the Arian controversy, and you had places where you have Arian churches and Orthodox churches, and I'm using that with a small o, churches that preserve the Orthodox faith in the person of Christ. But when you had, for example, in Rome, in Constantinople, in Ravenna, you have these churches literally down the block from each other. One is Arian, one is Orthodox. And they would stage processions, again, trying to outdo each other, and sometimes these processions would lead to riots and fist fights, because of course the Arians would be saying, you Orthodox are wrong, and the Orthodox are saying you're all heretics, and well, needless to say, that's not going to lead to going along and getting along. And in fact, in the church fathers and even in the civil authorities, one of the motivations of the Emperor Constantine to call the Council of Nicaea in 325 was the dissensions between these two parts of the church were threatening civil order. His attitude was, look, I'm not a theologian, I don't care about theology, I care about running the empire, and you guys, meaning the bishops, you guys need to sort this out, all right, so I don't have to keep, bringing in troops to break up riots. And actually, Constantine himself had Arian sympathies. Scholars kind of, nobody's actually sure, because it's not like Constantine left his own writings or anything like that. Anyway, so there is this process of standardization. Now, as the church is growing, she is growing out beyond Rome and the major cities of the empire. And so, for example, one area of the church that becomes very important historically is Gaul, or what would now be known as France. Because Gaul was Christianized in the 3rd and 4th centuries, but it's a long way from Rome. It's a long way from Rome. And so they developed some of their own distinct liturgical traditions. And that became, diversity in liturgical tradition is something that remained an issue in various ways in the church, really until the 17th, 18th century. And in fact, some of our most important documentary sources for the early liturgy come from these Gallic sources. And so what you saw happening is, as the church spread throughout the empire into these places that are far away from Rome, France, Spain, all right, Germany, these areas would develop their own distinct liturgical traditions. And there was always a tension between this diversity and the desire to make sure we're all on the same basic page, basic general thing together. So there's always this tension between these things. And in fact, there were at different points, and here we're talking really up through the 7th or 8th century, there were different attempts at in these different places, in Gaul, in Spain, and all these different places, at Romanization. Because what would happen is the bishops or the priests or pilgrims, they'd go to Rome and they'd see how Rome does it. And of course, they all knew Rome is the mother church for the world. The Pope is the visible head of the church. So the natural idea was, well, if they're doing it this way in Rome, we should do it that way here as well. And so there were rarely attempts by Rome herself, by the Holy See, there were rarely attempts of Rome to impose standardization or uniformity. That kind of thing was rare. But there were, as I said, in different places, these efforts that arose to Romanize or standardize the liturgy. And the most important of those really comes in the 8th, 9th century. Because what happened is you have Charlemagne, who becomes, in essence, the king of most of Christian Europe. France, part of Spain, part of Italy, all right? And he wants to unify his dominions. And one of the things he sees is, one of the things that will help me unify my kingdom is if we're all celebrating Mass the same way. And so he sends monks to Rome to get their copies of their liturgical books and bring them back to spread those throughout his empire. And that led to a great deal of Romanization or standardization throughout the empire. Now, until the 4th century, the liturgy was still in Greek, even in Rome. It's really only in the 4th century that you start to see a Latin liturgy develop. Now, that happened, that was adopted relatively quickly. The Greek liturgy really disappeared or fell, or the use of Greek exclusively in the liturgy really fell by the wayside within 100 years or so. Now, sorry, I'm looking. So, as I said, this development of the Latin liturgy began in the 4th century and really was solidified by the 7th century. Now, in your reading from Michael Kunzler, there's something I guess I want to kind of caution you on, all right? And that is that, I mean, Kunzler is a good historian, he's a good scholar. But like everyone, he has his own biases, he has his own, hobby horses or whatever. And one of his biases or hobby horses is essentially Middle Ages bad, everything before the Middle Ages and everything, after the 19th century good, all right? And so you have to be aware of that in reading him. Because, for example, he talks about how these, in the 8th century, that the adoption of Latin as the liturgical language pretty much, ended the possibility of liturgical participation on the part of the laity, all right? That's just nonsense. I mean, it's just plain nonsense, all right? One of the things you need to know is that in the 8th century, what we would now think of as modern European languages, French, Italian, Spanish, all right, they were still fairly close to Latin. I mean, you look at 8th century French, and I studied French and I studied Latin, all right? And if you knew French, you could read, you could understand, most of of the Latin at that point, because the French itself was so close to the Latin. Not only that, people had an inherited, if you will, cultural memory or understanding of these things. I mean, it's the same thing today, all right? This is a conversation I had some years ago in another parish, where a parishioner was complaining because we had started singing Kyrie eleison at Mass instead of Lord have mercy. And he comes to me and he's, Father, I don't like all this Latin stuff. I says, well, as I explained in my homily a few weeks ago, that's not Latin, it's Greek. And he says, well, yeah, but you know what? I don't know what Kyrie eleison means. I said, yes, you do. It means Lord have mercy. I mean, you know what it means. Maybe you never studied Latin or Greek, all right? But, I mean, come on, all right? I mean, let's just imagine for a moment that you have never heard a syllable of Latin in your life, and you've been going to Mass exclusively in English, all right? And after the through him, with him, and in him, the priest gets up and says, Precepti salutaribus moniti et divina institutionis formati audemus dicere, all right? Well, you know what's happening there. It's the Our Father. Maybe you don't know the Latin, but you know, oh, okay, this is the time for the Our Father. That must be what's going on, all right? And the priest or the people start, Pater noster qui es. I mean, yeah, maybe you never heard a word of Latin before, but here's a little clue, all right? Here is a little clue. The church, Holy Church, does not think that you are idiots, all right? Holy Church does not think that you are idiots, all right? And so she realizes that, you'll figure it out. You'll figure it out pretty quickly. And guess what? Even if you don't figure it out, well, that's what people like me are supposed to do, is help you figure it out. Again, this was a few years ago when we were introducing the new missal. I went to a workshop. I was at that time in